Welcome to our second webinar in the Belonging Project. We find ourselves in very strange times, and it would be odd if I started this webinar without acknowledging that there is a lot going on around us right now. People are going through a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings, a lot of experiences. Some people are experiencing trauma and anxiety. And turmoil that we're seeing. So I wanted to start this webinar off by saying that I acknowledge that this is a tough time for many people, and that even while you're here, you may be one of those people who does not feel like you're okay and still has to navigate through a lot. So with that said, welcome to the second webinar being offered by the Belonging Project. Now, as you know, the Belonging Project is a national collaborative initiative that was created. How do I move to the next? Okay. A national collaborative that was started by Saifa Shah, but we did this in partnership with national organizations, bar associations, nonprofits, consultants, law firms, and legal departments. And our goal is very simple: to focus on advancing diversity and inclusion during the pandemic. We want to be sure that we are supporting diverse lawyers and diverse law students who are impacted by the pandemic, because we do not want to see diversity and inclusion progress slide. So last week we talked about feedback. We talked about what feedback was, and we talked about how you can solicit feedback when you don't get it. And the reason this is an important discussion is because even though as leaders and as managers and as supervisors, we should know how to give effective feedback, we often do not. And now, yes, we can say that we should provide training for people in order to do that, and we should change our systems, and all of that is correct. But last webinar and this webinar is focused on what we can do when those fixes haven't already been put in place. And so today we're going to talk, just a quick refresher on what feedback is and why it's important. We're going to talk about the way in which implicit bias shows up in feedback, as well as in the feedback processes, from the individual interactions you have all the way through evaluation. And then we're going to talk about the way in which blind spots around cultural fluency and cultural differences also show up in how we give feedback. And we will end with talking about individual strategies. Now, here's what I like about this topic. If you're a leader, if you're a supervisor, and all of us have influence and supervise at least one person, everything that we talk about in terms of the obstacles and challenges that exist in the system will serve as an inclusive leadership session for you. Similarly, if you're on the receiving end, you'll get some tips and ideas that will help you identify when there are issues happening around the feedback that you need in order to succeed, but also some strategies on how you can move forward. So let's do the refresher. The refresher is very simple. We talked about this last time. Feedback is information that you receive from your environment and from the people that you're engaging with. Feedback can be verbal, it can be nonverbal. Feedback can be withdrawal, feedback can be movement toward. It's information. We receive information about the things that we're producing, about our performance, about whether we're making progress. When we set goals that we're supposed to be working towards, or when there are expectations about how we should progress within an organization, we receive feedback on how we're doing towards those goals. Now, the feedback may be information on a specific project. The feedback may be something more formal, like an evaluation that is scheduled maybe once a year or twice a year, depending on how often your organization does it. Because you can improve if you don't know where you can improve. Okay? So let's talk about ways in which implicit bias shows up in feedback. So A quick refresher. Most of us know what implicit bias is. We've gone to sessions that are about implicit bias. I'll be honest with you. We can have a 2-hour workshop dissecting the different kinds of bias, why they happen, and how they show up in talent management systems such as feedback and evaluation. But we're not going to do that today. Instead, we're going to talk generally about some common patterns that come up. We're not going to use language like affinity bias, halos and horns, although those are all applicable. Instead, we're going to talk in terms of patterns. So bias, when they show up in feedback, actually is a hindrance, not only to the cultivation of an inclusive organization, but it impedes individual diverse talent. And so there are 4 patterns of bias that we see. And this comes from Joan Williams's excellent work. And she has a book that she published with her daughter, Rachel Dempsey, called What Women Need at Work. If you have not read this book, you should read it. She's published lots of articles on this. And in fact, with this book and with her work, she has developed bias interrupters that people can use individually as well as an organization. And you will have that information with regard to feedback as handouts at the end of this presentation. And before I go further, I forgot to take care of some administrative business. If you have questions, please feel free to put those questions in the question and answer area. And when we get towards the end, Jenny is going to be reading those questions to me, and we will do our best to answer them and end on time. So the 4 types of bias we're going to talk about today: prove it again bias, tightrope bias, parental wall, tug of war. You may have heard of these, and you may have heard of them in different ways. Now, although her research primarily began around gender, what we have found and what you will see is that it also applies around race, and it applies around a lot of other diversity dynamics. So prove it again bias. If you're thinking of something that would remind you of prove it again bias, think about the phrase that some people are presumed competent and some people have to prove they're competent. Here's another one that many of us who are from underrepresented groups say, in particular people of color. I have to work twice as hard, 4 times as hard, just to be proven equal or as competent. Here's another one that we often say. When Johnny does something, we say, oh, it was a mistake. When we make a mistake, it becomes a characterization of our career. Now, these are examples of prove it again bias. What's happening here is that a group has already been stereotyped as being less competent, less able. And what they have to do is keep proving themselves over and over and over again. It's why many of us of color, those of us who are Black in particular, and I know this is true of many other ethnicities, we are told even by our parents, we have to work twice as hard. We have to work 4 times as hard just to be able to get the same respect and acknowledgement of our competencies. Now, people who this impacts, it's not just women, it impacts people of color, and it impacts individuals with disabilities, people who are older, people who are LGBTQ, and those who are first generation, those blue collar background people who are sort of class migrants. That impacts them. So here's some of the examples of how you see it at work. I already gave one example, right? When John Smith makes a mistake, we say, oh, he's a 2nd-year associate. I made those kind of mistakes. He's learning, he's growing. He has potential. When a person of color makes that mistake, the comment is, oh, I don't know if we can trust her work. Maybe we shouldn't have hired her because it looks like she's struggling, okay? Prove it again bias shows up when an opportunity comes up and we say, oh, John's ready for it. Like, John doesn't have trial experience, but we think John is confident. He talks about all the things that he's accomplished and he's ready. You know, we give him opportunities based on potential. But then with women and people of color, we want them to prove that they're ready. They have to prove that they have the skills and the ability. In other words, they have to have done it and done it well in order to be given the opportunity to move on. So that's proven again bias. And I'm sure with those examples, you have a lot of other examples of your own that you can relate to. The second gender pattern we're going to talk about, bias pattern, it's not just gender, is the tightrope. The tightrope is where there are defined behaviors that are expected of people because you're male or female or non-binary, or based on your race, right? We have these expectations of people and they pop up in an unconscious way. So when we have behaviors that we attribute to leadership and they are masculine behaviors and women exhibit those behaviors, we penalize them for that. I'll give an example from when I used to try cases. I found out that women who raise objections in trial are oftentimes deemed negatively, viewed negatively by jurors, even when they object less than male counterparts. Now get this, when you're making an objection, you're doing your job. You are protecting the record. You are making sure that what comes in and what doesn't come in is correct. But because we have this perception that women should not interrupt, we hold them to a higher standard. And so the ways in which this tightrope shows up is when certain things happen in the workplace, we say, oh, he's a leader, he's confident. And for the woman, we say, she's aggressive, she's too ambitious. That's one example that many of us can relate to. We can also relate to when women affirm and they step into leadership, that sometimes they are perceived as being less nice or even have the B word used on them, even when they're exhibiting the same behavior that their male counterparts are. Now, another way of looking at this could be the language that Catalyst uses, which is the double bind. And when it comes to gender, and this is particularly true for women of color, you can't be seen as nice and competent at the same time. And Sheryl Sandberg talks more about the studies and research that support this in her book, Lean In. In looking at identical resumes that were given to business students at a prestigious national business school, people deemed the male leader as nicer and more competent. And when they saw the same qualifications for the female leader, the assumption was she wasn't as nice. In order for her to be that competent, she's not as nice. We also see this with parenting, and we'll talk about this a little bit with the parental wall. But these are some of the examples where we are held to double standards and the expectations of what we're allowed to do are narrow. Now, it becomes a problem when, in order to proceed or progress in an organization, there are certain things you have to accomplish. And in order to do those things well, you have to have certain behaviors. But then when you exhibit those behaviors that are acceptable for others, you're penalized for them. And that's a problem. Okay? So the next gender pattern and bias pattern is one around parents. If you're a dedicated parent, you're not seen as committed to your work. If you're committed to work, it's assumed that you're not a good parent. And this can affect people of all genders. You know, with women, a lot of women have to feel compelled to just place on their calendars when they have an appointment. So it doesn't indicate whether it's something related to familial obligations, because then they're deemed not as committed to their work. With men, what we see is when a man has to go to Johnny's football practice or something like that, he gets a bump. He's seen favorably. Here's where that changes. That changes when it's not a one-off commitment. Men also are penalized for leaning into their parenthood when they have the audacity to do things like ask for the same amount of parental leave that women would take. So those are some of the ways in which the parental wall comes up. Now, here's how it has practical examples. I have a baby, I go on maternity leave, and the thought is she going to come back? Is she going to be committed? I come back, I'm working the same hours, I am billing the same as what I used to do before, but my hours are now different. So I'm billing the same, but because I have drop off and pick up, I'm working it differently. I'm now, all the chit chat, all the hanging out is cut out. The perception that I am working less is there. Male attorney has a baby or partner has the baby, and they are seen as having more responsibility and therefore having a family to support. And we see the differential in income. When women have children, sometimes assumptions are made about their priorities, and sometimes well-intentioned things happen. So I'll give an example that happened to me. Just before I had my first child, I had all these cases that I was trying to ramp up and doing action plans for and making sure I got things done. I had back-to-back depositions. And one of my paralegals came in and said, this is crazy. You're going to have this baby prematurely. Your schedule is too busy, da, 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 da. And I'm like, I'm fine. It's good. I just don't want to leave a mess for someone else. Like, I want to leave these cases in a good place for those who are going to be sort of handling it while I'm gone on maternity leave. I looked at the calendar. I had a mediation, not where I live. I had to travel to get there. And I told the partner that I was helping on that case, hey, I just realized, because I wasn't acting like I was pregnant, right? I was acting like I was going to work all the way till I had the baby, which in fact is what I did. But I didn't think about the fact that I couldn't travel. So I got another employment lawyer. It was an employment case, not some of my other work. Got him involved to handle that mediation and let the partner who originated the case know that this other partner was going to handle the mediation, not the whole case, the mediation, because it was within 2 weeks of my delivery and I shouldn't be traveling. As it turns out, I did have that baby 2 weeks before she was due. Assumptions now made that I am too busy to handle other matters, even after I've gone on maternity leave and I've come back and I'm working full time. Sometimes what we see is people will make a decision not to tell you about a career accelerating opportunity, the ability to have a developmentally rich experience that will help you in your career because they've decided that you don't want to travel or you have a new baby and you don't want to juggle those things. Those are ways in which people could be well-intentioned and still harm you in your career. And it can affect the kind of feedback that you get, where even though you're doing the same things as someone in a different situation, you're perceived as less committed for a variety of reasons. So that's something to watch out for. The last is tug of war, and we're not going to spend much time on this. You've probably heard of the queen bee syndrome. For some of you, you've heard about the crabs in a barrel. The idea is that sometimes there are women or people of color or people from an underrepresented group who are not supportive of others from that group and may even do things to harm them, that sometimes there's conflict. And you hear it between women generationally, right? Where you hear millennial women complain that the boomer woman don't support them, and you hear a boomer woman saying the millennial woman just don't want to do what it takes to succeed. And then the Gen Xers, of course, they always forget about us, but you know, you get the gist. And what I want people to pay attention to when it comes to the tug of war is that it's not personal, it's about the organization. If you have an organization that has cultivated the culture that it's only going to allow one woman, if you have a culture that's the kind of culture that one Black person makes it onto the executive committee and everybody's like, oh, we're good, we've met our diversity token, you're going to have these kind of issues because you're setting up the culture where people are being pit against each other, okay? So something to be aware of when sometimes the feedback that you get, it seems like it is harsher coming from a fellow woman or coming from a fellow Black person or coming from a fellow Asian American or a fellow LGBT professional. That's tug of war. So now let's talk about cultural fluency. and the ways in which blind spots exist in how we give communication, how we give feedback, and how we have it inbuilt into our feedback systems. Now, before I do that, let me actually say one more thing about the patterns of bias. These are not just patterns that exist in one-on-one interactions. The bias blind spots are often built into our evaluation systems. So when we have evaluation systems that say people should give feedback on initiative, leadership, business development skills, all of those things, in most organizations, we are not also including specifics of what the kind of behaviors could be and making it clear to people that the behaviors could be beyond that. And when we don't do that, people now bring their subjectivity to the evaluation. So you have someone saying somebody lacks initiative, but really it's the parental wall that's kicking in. Or someone says that someone is not a team player, but in fact, the tightrope is what is kicking in. So the process itself for the evaluation, if you don't have a system that helps steer people away from bias and give them tips and tools, and if you don't have a way of having your inclusion and diversity team assist in evaluating feedback and evaluations periodically to identify those blind spots and correct them, you end up with an organizational problem. So, cultural fluency. Cultural fluency is another aspect that is critically important. We see cultural differences that show up on a number of dimensions, but the only ones I'm going to hit on today are 4: direct versus indirect communication, high hierarchy versus low hierarchy, collectivist cultures versus individualistic, and expressive versus non-expressive. So let's back up. What are we talking about when we say culture and cultural fluency? Culture is the single most important lens through which we look at life and value our experiences, behavior. By the time we're 3, our culture lens that we use to look at the world is set. Just like implicit bias, with culture, we take for granted often that everybody's on the same page. So when someone does something and we think, gosh, that's rude, we're assuming that they're looking at the event and their behavior through the same cultural lens. And sometimes we're not. This transfers over to feedback and evaluations because we put specific traits that we say are important, sometimes without analyzing whether those traits actually have anything to do with success. And we don't stop and think, what culture are these attributes? What culture are these behaviors related to? And because the legal profession has been dominated by men, dominated by white men, heterosexual men, we have a heteronormative lens that is Anglo. And so when you have people who come from different backgrounds and different experiences who are in the system, their behavior that may be different, their way of processing that may be different, their way of valuing things that may be different, ends up hurting them unless they're able to adapt. This is a burden because when you're in an environment where you as the individual are always adapting, but the environment is not similarly adapting to you, it's a tax, it's a burden, you end up conforming, you end up covering, and it's a huge contributor to attrition of diverse talent. So cultural fluency refers to your ability or your organization's ability to adapt across differences. It goes beyond just knowing that something's different. It goes beyond telling people that if you go to Japan and you have a business meeting, you can't just walk in and start talking about business. There are these things that you have to go through. It's more than that. When you're culturally fluent, you not only have the knowledge that there are differences, you have the awareness to be present when those differences kick in. You have non-judgment about the differences. That is to say, you're not criticizing. You're not saying these people are lazy. These people are never on time. They don't respect my time. You're non-judgmental. And you are pausing to exhibit behavior that is inclusive. To say, this is what this means to me. It may mean something different. How do I pivot? In order for us to have inclusive organizations, we need to be doing both. Individuals need to adapt and organizations need to adapt. One thing I didn't say is that I'm struggling with sinusitis and a cough that's been on and off for several months. No, it's not coronavirus, COVID-19. But if I start coughing, please forgive me if I have to take a break. So direct and indirect communication. This refers to how cultures have differences in how they communicate. So in some cultures, people are very direct. And by direct, they use the words for the literal translation of what that word is. Whereas in indirect cultures, there's a reliance on common understanding of common norms and the ability of people to read nuance and to listen not just to what is said, but also how it is said. Now, I'm going to do an exercise. In the comments section or in the chat section, I'm going to go out here. Let me see how I can do this. I am determined to be better at technology. Okay, in the chat section, or maybe we don't have a chat section, maybe we only have question and answer. Can you give me examples of times, or let me back up, let me ask a different question. What do we think of people who come from cultures that are more direct? For example, people from the East Coast, people from New York, who are more direct. Throw in the question and answer some examples. We often find ourselves in situations when you have the direct and indirect, and also put in the comments what people, or in the question and answer, what people from direct cultures think of people from indirect cultures. So what happens in the workplace is someone from a direct culture says, thank you for this work product. I can see you put a lot of work into it. It did not meet my standards, and here's how. If you're a woman, you have the combination of the direct and indirect differences coming in, but you also have that gender. So you're harsh, you're aggressive. I see harsh, aggressive, curt, and sensitive. Conversely, when people from direct cultures are conversing with people from indirect cultures, they often feel like, why are they dancing around things? Why are they being passive aggressive? Why won't they just say, you said this and I thought it was this, but now it's something else, okay? So those are the things that can come up. This matters because you can be given somebody feedback and you and them are having a completely different conversation. And I see that often with diverse talent, in particular women and minorities. And this feeds into what we talked about last time, where sometimes we give soft evaluations or we're just so broad that people don't know what we're talking about, or we sandwich the feedback. So that's something else that happens in indirect cultures. We want to start with something good. We want to go in the middle. We want to end with something good. Then the person walks away and their chief diversity officer goes to check in on them. I know you had your review. I know you got some feedback. How can I support you in coming up with a plan on what you want to do between now and the next evaluation so you can move forward? And they say, oh, I had a great evaluation. I mean, I heard that I was doing good in this and good in this and good in this. And I just had one little thing that I needed to work on, right? But when the chief diversity person talked to the partners, they said, oh, this is such a problem. And if this doesn't improve, we're going to have to discuss next actions. That is a problem, okay? So let's go to the next type of cultural dimension that we see, and that's collectivist versus individualistic. In individualistic cultures, we place more emphasis on personal power, on independence, on sort of this bootstraps mentality, right? In collectivist cultures, it's more about the group. And many ethnic groups are more collective. Many Western cultures are more individualistic. And American culture, Anglo-American culture, is fairly individualistic on the spectrum. Collectivist groups are going to prize what's best for the group, what's best for the community. Goals and priorities are going to be based on cohesion. You see this breakdown around gender as well. Women generally tend to be more collectivist and men less so. So the way women often lead is to bring consensus, to bring cohesion, to get input from everyone, to make sure we make the right decision for the group, but that everyone is going along. For people who come from cultures like that, when you are doing your evaluation and you need to talk about what you've done, we tend to minimize our accomplishments. So someone says, Corey, you're the leader of this project. You did an incredible job. I'm quick to say, thank you. It was a team effort. Even though you were the leader, you could say, thank you. I appreciate it. I did X. We have a tendency not to use the I. Now, it's a double edge because remember the tightrope. We know that we have to be able to claim our accomplishments so that we can be moved along in our career trajectory. But because of the tightrope, when we do, we can be seen negatively because we're violating norms. Imagine this on the collectivist and individualistic level when you're giving feedback to people. Is the situation that someone is really weak, or are they actually a really good leader who knows how to bring consensus and bring people together? If you look at a lot of the leadership attributes that are valued in the workplace, they tend to be more individualistic, they tend to be more masculine. Thankfully, we know from research and discussions that we as a society are beginning to appreciate more the collectivist approach and the feminine approach to leadership. Expressive versus non-expressive. This not only can impact feedback and evaluations, but even your day-to-day work experiences. So in expressive cultures, people use more gestures, they're more vivid with their metaphors, they may be more dramatic, okay? In less expressive cultures, public displays of emotion are frowned upon, right? You want to keep your body reserved into a minimum. You're not necessarily using your body to talk and express yourself. What happens in workplaces, depending on the culture, the American culture generally is somewhat in the middle. It's somewhat expressive, but not as expressive. Definitely not as expressive as the culture I grew up in, or maybe even the Italian culture, or many Latin American cultures. Not all of them. Some of them are more reserved. But then there are other cultures that are definitely more reserved. And people come to the organization differently. We want to be careful when we're giving people feedback about whether they seem committed or interested, that we're not basing it on views and values of how we think people should be expressing themselves. We want to be sure that we're not giving people feedback that they're too loud, they're too intense, they're too passionate because they're more expressive. We certainly don't want to create situations where people are accused of being angry or intimidating. And that could be a combination of a number of things. It could be a combination of racism. Yes, we don't want to use that word, but it exists and it's a real thing. And we should use the word. It could be implicit bias, which is related to racism, which we don't want to use the word. It could be gender norms on what is okay and what isn't. So I'll give an example. We know from studies that when men express anger, they're viewed as more powerful. When women express anger, we're perceived as out of control. Now, regardless of what political group you're in, close your eyes and think about recent elections. You should smile. She seems angry. You're a former prosecutor. You're now a senator. You're cross-examining a witness, and you're called hysterical. Even though your tone is firm, you don't raise your voice, and you are a classic example of good cross-examination. You can see there where gender intersects with the expressive versus non-expressive. Because if you're not demure enough, it's a problem. So we're actually making good time. It's 2:37. Wow. Let's talk about individual strategies, okay? And here are some things that you can do. Be sure that you yourself are not holding yourself to a higher standard. I'll give a classic example. I have been in positions where I have looked at a job opportunity and I have held myself back because I didn't have every single thing there. And just as people have coached me, I now coach other people. Go for it. Go for it. Because there are people who don't meet every single criteria and they do it. We sometimes hold ourselves up to a level of perfection. And this is where it's a double whammy. We're taught we have to work twice as hard, 4 times as hard, which is true. But at certain points, that very lesson of working harder holds you back. Because others perceive you as being here and you see yourself here. So sometimes how we view ourselves and how we view our progress and how we view our abilities is not accurate. If you're going to make sure that when you get feedback, you're able to ask the right questions, you're able to get clarification, or you're able to correct the record, you cannot do this when you yourself are holding yourself to higher standards. So start with making sure you get feedback from good, trusted people, just like we talked about in the last webinar. You need people who can speak truth into you. You need people who can help you compare, who can say, whoa, 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 whoa. You're making this hard on yourself. This person here, they're not doing all that. So I get it. I get it that you're a woman and you're concerned. I get it that you're gay and you're concerned. I get it that you're Hispanic and you're concerned. But the truth is, you've done the thing. You're ready, okay? Another thing that we have to do, we have to keep records of our achievements. If your organization has benchmarks of how you progress from one phase to the other, you should have those benchmarks. Every year, you should be creating a personal development plan for yourself that's tied into those benchmarks. You should be taking the feedback that you get from your evaluations and your reviews that you get individually throughout the year and feedback that you get from people and incorporating that into what am I going to work on, what am I going to improve, and how am I going to measure it. Measurement is key. If they want you to develop somewhat of an expertise around taking fact depositions, you don't get to just take 2 and check it off, okay? You need to understand what does it take to demonstrate that level of competency that they're looking for. Craft a plan for yourself to achieve those things and keep meticulous records. Because here's what you can do. When you get feedback saying, I know that you think you should be moved to the next level. However, you haven't done A, B, C. You can say, actually, I have. Here's what I've done. Or if they say you're not ready for the next level, you can say, I'd really like to talk to you about that. Because as I understand it, here are the benchmarks or here's the criteria, or you can do what I did one time to someone, which is, can you tell me what the criteria is? And then they tell you the criteria, you say, that's what I understood it was, and this is what we have on our benchmarks, or our litigation skills, or whatever we want to call it, competencies. And I have done boom, 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 boom. And so I'm trying to understand, what is it that I need to still do beyond this in order to be promoted to that next level? If you don't have meticulous records, you won't have that to produce. If you're not using measurements and metrics, you risk being fluffy. There's a difference between saying, I've taken 10 expert depots, to saying, I have done, let's just go with 10 expert depots, ranging from a case with XYZ, with this kind of expert, and the case had these complexities. When I got the case, when I was put on the case, we were here. And my work in this allowed us to do that. You want to stay factual. You want to stay objective. You want to just state the facts about what you've done. Track the positive feedback that you get. That's the third strategy. When I was still in law school, I prosecuted in a county that had a university. So it was a university town. So I had some fun cases that I prosecuted. Yeah, I digress. And one of the ladies there, one of the prosecutors had given me a compliment, said that, he was very impressed with certain things I had done, seemed surprised that I was just a student, wanted to make it clear that if I really wanted to do that kind of work, I should really consider working with them, blah, blah, blah. So he leaves, and then the woman who was supposed to be supervising me comes over and says, hey, that's actually a pretty big deal. And are you keeping a glory file? I'm like, glory file? You should keep a glory file. Every time someone says something good, write it down, put it away. You get an email commending you on something, put it away. You get something from a client commending you on something, print it out, put it away. Let me tell you how my glory file has helped me. My glory file actually has helped me when I'm feeling in a funky place about where I am in my career. Or when I've made a mistake and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. So your glory file is going to help for more than one thing. But the good thing about a glory file is it ties into that second strategy I told you about. You have examples. You have examples of when you made a difference. And when it comes time to write your self-evaluation, you can reference some of those things. If you get good comments and good commendations from people, be sure to share that. I've seen situations where a female attorney that I worked with was upset because she'd done a lot of great things. And when she would get feedback from the client, she would tell the partner whose client it was. She was a more junior partner. He was senior. We were junior partners at this time. But one day at the printer, she saw that unlike in her situations, there was a white male attorney who was being groomed as, this partner's protege, even though she'd done more work for him for longer. And he forwarded something he had done that the client complimented. And this partner forwarded that email to the entire partnership and the executive committee to brag on this person. And I think what upset her was not so much that that happened, but that she knows that wasn't happening for her. And those are the kind of things that remind us that having sponsors and people who are invested in our career is important. You definitely want to let the people that you work with, the people who are responsible for those clients or the specific project, know about positive feedback that you received. You also want your influencers and your sponsors to also know somebody's mentoring you. Let them know. Because here's what a good mentor and here's what a good sponsor will do. We will amplify it. We will let other people know about what you've done and how you're doing. We will remind people, hey, she just did this really good thing. I want you to keep her in mind for other opportunities. So don't keep that information to yourself. Now, if you come from a culture like mine, where you were told the entire time you were growing up, that's bragging, or you were told, you want a pat on your shoulder for doing excellent work, that's the expectation. You're supposed to do excellent work. You're not going to get a prize for doing that. Or if you come from a culture that says, you just put your head down and work hard and you'll be rewarded, this is going to be hard. As women in most of our cultures, we're also taught not to brag. And the things that men may do that may be accepted as normal, for us may be criticized as bragging. So figure out what the culture of your organization is, what is authentic to you, and the way in which you can provide this information when you need to so that you get good feedback, but also so that you can correct incorrect information if needed. For more strategies, be ready to offer specific objective examples. I've already covered that. Be willing to ask uncomfortable questions. And this goes to the webinar that we had last time. If you did not watch that webinar, please go back and watch it, okay? I gave you concrete strategies when you're being told something that you know is not true. It's uncomfortable, but we have to be willing to say things like, can you help me understand why you thought that? Somebody puts an evaluation that you're not reliable, you didn't get something to them on time, and you're sitting there going, what in the world are they talking about? I don't even know what they're talking about. And maybe the evaluation system is one like a lot of organizations have, where it's blinded. You don't even know who said it. You don't even know the context. Have to be willing to say, thank you for the feedback. I really want to grow. Can you tell me more? You have to be willing to say, I really would like this opportunity. Help me understand the criteria. And then follow up with, I'm thankful that you gave me that information. Here are all the things that I've done to meet that criteria. You have to be willing to say, what is it that I need to do to go to the next level? Because here are all the things that I've done. You have to be willing to say, if push comes to shove, I appreciate this. And I don't like the fact that I am now in this position, but I have to say, what is it that John has done that I am not doing? Because based on my review, da 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 da. Now that last one, you better be careful when you use that. You better make sure you have all your ducks in a row. You want to make sure that when you're making comparisons, that your comparisons are apples to apples. The worst thing people can do, and I've seen them do it for evaluations, I've seen them do it for partner comp, where they ask for something to be reviewed, they push back, and lo and behold, there's a whole bunch of other stuff this person has done that you didn't do that justifies it. Make sure that you're right, okay? So these are the individual strategies. I mentioned Bias Interrupters Project. The Bias Interrupters Project actually has information on a website that you can find, and it's general. There's information around promotions, there's information around recruiting and hiring, information around feedback and evaluation. Dig into it. Joan Williams, through the Center for Work Life that she leads, also partnered with MCCA and the ABA, and they did a separate bias interrupters project on how we can interrupt bias in our organizations. And they came up with a toolkit. And so you can access this. You can get the executive summary off of the MCCA site or even the ABA site. And it goes into more detail and is more specific for lawyers. If you are a leader in your organization, I implore you to use those toolkits. If you are a leader in an organization, I implore you to take everything that I've talked about today and make sure that your inclusion team and your talent team or professional development team are talking. Make sure that these inclusive principles are being incorporated into not just how you do feedback and evaluations, but every single step of your talent strategy. It should be part of the talent strategy. It should be part of the inclusion and diversity strategy. It should be part of the organization's growth strategy. There are organizational fixes that need to happen. What we're talking about is telling people how they can survive in a system that really is not ideal. But as leaders, we can fix the system and make it even better. So the code, if you want CLE is pending, but we've applied for it and I'm confident that we will get it. The code is SS4472. I'll repeat that. S as in Sam, S4472. So we've done very well on time. It's 2:51. So Jenny, do I have any questions?
I do not see questions in the Q&A. Let's give a couple of minutes to do that.
All right.
But Corey, I do want to double check the code that you gave us.
Yes.
Code I see is S is in Cypharth, 4772.
No, 4472.
4472. Okay.
Yeah. Did I say that wrong? Let me check. Ooh, you're right. I'm wrong.
All right. It's S is in Sam, 4772.
Yes. I transposed a number here. And I thank God for you. I would have had some annoyed people emailing me. All right.
We invite anyone to have questions. Put them in the Q&A.
If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A, please. And surely somebody has questions.
I see one question now.
Okay.
At what point do you go above your manager's head?
That's an excellent question. Okay. So I think what's hard about that is you have to factor in the political climate in your organization. Okay. You have to know what makes a situation better and what makes a situation worse. I would say here are some things to consider when you think you have to go over someone's head. Consider the culture of the organization and how they react to people who do that, okay? Because if you have a culture that is even the kind of culture that's going to penalize you if you say, I would like this reviewed or I would like a reconsideration of this, you need to know that. Because then you can decide what you want to do. You can decide, is it worth fighting or do I just move around this? I would recommend that you get the advice of mentors that you trust who know the culture and know the people. I would suggest that you have some knowledge about the manager above your manager, how they lead, how they communicate, and how they make hard decisions. As much as it pains me to say this, we have a lot of leaders who will not make hard decisions. We have leaders who will not step in when something improper is happening because they don't want to cause a fluster, okay? We have leaders also who, when they have people who report to them who are just so good at what they do and they rely on them, who allow some improper things to happen. So you want to know this. You want to know what kind of leader this is. Are they actually going to listen? Are they going to be empathetic? And are they going to try and help solve the situation? Fourth, analyze what this will do for your relationship with the manager. Because in many situations, when you go over your manager's head, that relationship between you and your manager forever dampened. I've learned something, my father taught me this a long time ago. There are a lot of things that people will forgive you. Embarrassing them or humiliating them is not forgivable. They won't forgive you. They'll hold it against you. Make sure that you're able to do this in a way that the manager who you're going over will not receive this in a humiliating way, which of course is tied to how the leader above functions. Are they going to be the kind of person who will put them on blast, or will they handle it discreetly? And then consider what the issue is. If it's harassment, if it's abusive, if it's bullying, and the organization says that's not with their values, I think you should strongly consider going above their head. If you have mentors and sponsors who can advocate for you, use them. Okay? I hope that gave you enough tips that you can lay out. Like, I'm a whiteboard person. Lay it all out and say the pros, the cons, and then you decide based on what you want out of your career, what the long-term implications are, and also your authenticity. Because I know that there are decisions I've made that other people wouldn't make, and it's based on my line. And I do have a line on the sand on what's okay and what's not. There are a lot of things I can take. People yelling at me and disrespecting me, no, that doesn't work. Jenny, next question, please.
Yes. What is the best way to respond to feedback that is factually incorrect without sounding argumentative?
I think the best way to respond to feedback that's factually incorrect is with facts. And that's why it's important to be keeping track of what you're doing. It's important to be measuring and have metrics of what you're doing against the benchmarks, and to be able to say, thank you, I respect your feedback, and I appreciate the feedback because I know you didn't have to give me the feedback, and you giving me this feedback gives me an opportunity to course correct. However, I do want to discuss this feedback with you because you said X, and I don't really understand how you came to that perception, although I understand that it is, but the truth is why. This is where some of the other things we talked about come in. If you're a Black woman and you're firm and you're passionate, people may start to act like, oh, she was argumentative. You need to decide how you want to deal with that. My personal choice is I'm an intense person, and it's okay. And I'm willing to say, I know this may seem intense, and it's because I feel this way. I am okay saying it seems like I'm upset, and it's because I'm upset. And I think I have the right to be upset because this unjust thing happened. Again, you have to know the culture. You have to know the temperament of the person. You have to have allies who can help back you up and all of that. Okay? Next question, because I think we're running out of time.
Yep, we got 2 minutes. Let's see if we can do this one. In light of today's climate, do you have any recommendations for D&I leaders on action planning post-protests that can demonstrate to Gen Zs and millennials that they are actively improving diversity and inclusion?
Well, I think the most important thing that we have to keep center of mind is that it's not about showing or demonstrating, it's about doing the actual work. And I think a lot of times in our industries, we spend a lot of time talking and not doing. We spend a lot of time, talking about the vision and what we hope to accomplish. And like a friend of mine has said for years, Ernest Tuckett, diversity and inclusion is the only area that lawyers give themselves awards for not getting the job done, and we give ourselves awards for efforts. So post the protest, and even right now, what we have to do to actually walk the talk, which is what will demonstrate it for millennials and Gen Z, we have to make sure that the people most impacted by the problem have a say in how things go. In other words, we shouldn't be making plans and strategies without getting input from the people impacted. We should be talking to Gen Z. We should be talking to millennials. We should be getting their input. We should be including them in ideas and strategies. We should do this from the bottom of the organization all the way to the top. We should be having listening sessions. We should be having focus groups. And if you already have an active D&I team, they're already doing these things. It may not be obvious to everyone, and not everyone in the organization may know what's going on, but for the most part, these things are going on. We have to also do a better job telling people what we're doing. It's one area that almost universally we fail, and it's not just in diversity and inclusion, it's with everything, with transparency, being willing to say to people, here's what we're working on, here's where we're not doing so well, here's where we're doing well, here are the next steps. That allows people not to fill in the blanks with their own story. But some of the tangible things that we have to do, that's always been true, but is even more true now. We have got to choose courage. We can't back away from the thing because it's uncomfortable. Neither can we back away from it because people may have a negative reaction. And one of the things that's unique about this time is that there are diversity issues that people would not want to address because they will try to package them as political. And we have to have the foresight, the clarity, the ability to communicate why these are human issues, why they are workplace issues, how they impact the engagement of our talent, and how we have to approach our solutions from that perspective. I hope that answers your question. And I think we're over time. We
are, and that was the last question.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. It's 3:01. Wow. And the code one last time, this time correctly, S as in Cypherth, S as in Cypherth, 4772. The next two webinars, one is going to be on advice I would give my 30-year-old self. It's going to be an excellent conversation about resilience, grit, bounding back from failures, authenticity, and navigating being underrepresented in a majority world. And then the other one is going to be a conversation with our nation's affinity bar leader, talk about diversity and inclusion and what we need to be doing to prioritize in the pandemic. So I look forward to seeing you. Stay tuned for more, and thank you. Don't forget to fill out the forms that you received today if you want CLE credit. Thanks. It's 3:02. Thank you.